Bad news shouts. Good news whispers. Despair is rough. Hope is gentle. The season of Advent affirms good news in bad times. Advent is all about hope. The prayers and the scriptures assigned to this season point toward God's future, a future of joy and peace, a future of health and plenty, a future of life and love. Hope can be hard to hang on to in dark times. Bad news shouts. Good news whispers. Despair is rough, hope is gentle, and Advent is all about hope. Last week brought me a little whisper of hope, and it was from an unlikely source, Hollywood. This industry that brings us horror movies and war movies and violently action flicks also brings us something else this year. A movie about Mr. Rogers, of all people. And I was surprised that Tom Hanks got the part. I mean, sure, he's a nice guy and a good actor, but Mr. Rogers, really? And then I heard an interview with him about the movie, which I have not yet seen, but I want to. Turns out the movie is based on a magazine article that I actually came across a number of years ago. In 1998, Esquire magazine did a series of articles on new heroes. Mikhail Gorbachev was profiled, as were Ronald Reagan and Muhammad Ali. Well, there was this reporter named Tom Junod, and this reporter had a reputation for doing hatchet jobs. He would eventually find the real dirt on the people he was profiling. He was the one assigned to write about Fred Rogers. And the funny thing is, later on, he found out that Mr. Rogers had specifically asked for him to do the article. Fred Rogers knew of his reputation as a tough reporter, but he also knew it would be a fair profile. So this grizzled, cynical reporter wanted to get the lowdown on this man in the red cardigan sweater with the soft voice. And what he found out was there was no con. Fred Rogers was the same person off screen as he was as Mr. Rogers on his TV program. He was a man of kindness, compassion, caring, gentleness, and love. Now, as I said, I came across this article years ago, and now it interests me that the story of this cynical reporter investigating Mr. Rogers is the subject of this new Tom Hanks movie. To me, this is a whisper of hope. In a dark world, this is a shining light. In a time of bad news, this is some good news. Now, part of the Christian life is the challenge to imitate Christ. But we all know that's a pretty tall order, right? So maybe once in a while, instead of asking, what would Jesus do? We could lower our sights a little. We could ask, what would Mr. Rogers do? You know, we could do a whole lot worse than living by that code. This magazine reporter described the day Fred and a friend got on a New York subway car. The train car was full of Hispanic and black children riding home from school. And none of them approached Mr. Rogers to ask for an autograph. They just sang. All at once, all together, they broke into the song from his TV show, "It's a Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, Won't You Be My Neighbor?" This whole clattering train car turned into a single choir on the spot. But that's not my favorite story from this magazine article. My favorite story was this one. Fred Rogers once went to visit a teenage boy, and this boy had severe cerebral palsy and could only speak using his computer. This boy was also angry much of the time. One of his few pleasures in life was watching Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And here are the words of Tom Junod from this article. At first, the boy was made very nervous by the thought that Mr. Rogers was visiting him. He was so nervous, in fact, that when Mr. Rogers did visit, he got mad at himself. And he began hating himself and hitting himself, and his mother had to take him to another room and talk to him. Mr. Rogers did not leave, though. He wanted something from the boy. And when Mr. Rogers wants something from someone, he never leaves. He just waited patiently. And when the boy came back, Mr. Rogers talked to him. And then he made his request. He said, "I would like you to do something for me. Would you do something for me?" On his computer, the boy answered, yes, of course. He would do anything for Mr. Rogers. So Mr. Rogers said, "I would like you to pray for me. Would you pray for me?" And now the boy didn't know how to respond. He was thunderstruck because nobody had ever asked him for something like that, ever. The boy had always been prayed for. The boy was always the object of prayer. And now he was being asked to pray for Mr. Rogers. And although he didn't know if he could do it, he said he would. He said he would try. And ever since then, he keeps Mr. Rogers in his prayers. And he doesn't talk about wanting to die anymore because he figures that Mr. Rogers is close to God. And if Mr. Rogers likes him, that must mean God likes him too. As for Mr. Rogers himself, he doesn't look at this story the same way the boy or I did. In fact, when Mr. Rogers told me the story, I complimented him on being smart, for knowing that asking the boy for his prayers would make the boy feel better about himself. And Mr. Rogers responded by looking at me first with puzzlement and then with surprise. He said, "Oh, heavens no, Tom. I didn't ask him for his prayers for him. I asked for me. I asked because I think that anyone who has gone through challenges like that must be very close to God. I asked him because I wanted his intercession." Now, you all know I'm the parent of a child with a profound disability. And as you can imagine, this story speaks to me very deeply. When I'd been a priest maybe, 7 years, and my daughter was roughly 10 years old, I realized then that she was much closer to God than I ever would be. Mr. Rogers would have agreed, I'm sure. The magazine writer went with Fred Rogers in a cab to Penn Station in New York City to film a segment for Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. A crowd gathered around Mr. Rogers as soon as he stepped onto the sidewalk. Tom Junod wrote, "There was Mr. Rogers, putting his arms around someone, or wiping the tears on someone's cheek, or passing around the picture of someone's child, or getting on his knees to talk to a child." And in that crowd, there were some pretty thuggish-looking guys at the back, maybe street gang members, and one of them said, "Hey, it's Mr. freaking Rogers." And I believe we could do a whole lot worse than imitating Mr. freaking Rogers. He was an ordained Presbyterian minister that never worked for a church. He made his ministry one of children's television, and he never had to mention God on a show, not even once. Today's reading from Isaiah tells us to walk in the light of the Lord, the one who will teach us to beat our swords into plowshares and give up war. The words of St. Paul talked about the armor of light in his writing to the Romans. I love that phrase, put on the armor of light. And the people that put the prayer book together must have liked it too, because they used those words in our collect for the day, the prayer I used near the beginning of the service. Bad news shouts, good news whispers. Despair is rough, hope is gentle. So put on the armor of light. This new movie about the gentle Mr. Rogers is, to me, an Advent whisper of hope. In Advent and always, let's hold on to hope. Amen.